How do you express uncertainty? You may say, maybe. How do you agree you feel the same way? You may say, me too. What's a phrase about the power of money? You may say, money talks. How do you say something is probable? You may say, most likely. What's another way to say, you're welcome? You may say, my pleasure. How do you say you're doing extremely well? You may say, never better. How do you dismiss a small issue? You may say, never mind. What's an idiom for not giving up? You may say, never say die. How do you say it's always a good time to start? You may say, never too late. How do you suggest another opportunity? You may say, next time.
How do you end a first meeting politely? You may say, nice meeting you. How might you end a good conversation? You may say, nice talking to you. What do you say to express surprise? You may say, no kidding. What's another way to say, you're welcome? You may say, no problem. How do you say something is easy? You may say, no sweat. What do you say to express disbelief? You may say, no way. How do you say something makes sense now? You may say, no wonder. How do you say something is impossible? You may say, not a chance. What's a moderate compliment? You may say, not bad. How do you politely disagree? You may say, not really.
How do you say things are okay? You may say, not too bad. How do you say you're not doing well? You may say, not too good. What do you say when nothing new is happening? You may say, nothing much. How do you say something is common knowledge? You may say, nothing new about that. How do you say Therese no update? You may say, nothing new. How do you express frustration or confusion about what should happen next? Often when Therese been a problem or setback. You may say, now what? How do you express surprise or disbelief, or ask for confirmation about something? You may say, really? How do you ask someone to repeat what they just said because you didn't hear or understand them? You may say that again. How do you ask if someone is being truthful or not joking about something? You may say, serious? How do you ask someone to repeat what they've said because you didn't hear or understand, or express regret for a minor mistake? You may say, sorry. What's a casual way to say, okay? You may say, okie dokie. How do you say you strongly disagree? You may say, on the contrary. How do you describe something rare? You may say, once in a blue moon. What do you say when you feel pain? You may say, ouch. How do you say something is not possible? You may say, out of the question. How do you tell someone to hurry? You may say, pick it up. How do you invite someone to have fun? You may say, please enjoy yourself. What do you say to help someone unwind? You may say, please relax. How do you make a polite request? You may say, please. How do you show sympathy? You may say, poor thing. How do you say you're doing well, but not great? You may say, pretty good. What do you say to show surprise or doubt? You may say, really? How do you agree with a feeling or situation? You may say, same here. What do you say to return a greeting? You may say, same to you. What do you say to make someone smile for a photo? You may say cheese. How do you ask someone to greet another for you? You may say hello for me. How do you ask someone to repeat something? You may say that again. How do you ask someone to indicate when to stop? You may say when. What's a way to say goodbye for now? You may say, see you later. How do you say goodbye briefly? You may say, see you. What do you ask to confirm if someone is not joking? You may say, serious? How do you express disappointment in someone's actions? You may say, shame on you. How do you say you find someone attractive? You may say, she is my style. How do you compliment someone's elegance? You may say, she is very sophisticated. What's an exclamation of disappointment or surprise? You may say, shoot. How do you say to ignore or pass over something? You may say, skip it. How do you express that something failed or ended? You may say, so much for that. What do you say when surprised by quick timing? You may say, so soon. How do you ask why something is important? You may say, so what? How do you say there's nothing left of something? You may say, sold out. How do you say that certain aspects stay the same? You may say, some things never change. How do you express suspicion? You may say, something's fishy. What's a polite way to interrupt someone? You may say, sorry to bother you. How do you ask for clarification politely? You may say, sorry. What do you say to agree with a plan? You may say, sounds good. How do you tell someone to speak loudly or clearly? You may say, speak out. How do you ask if someone is able to communicate in Spanish? You may say, speaking Spanish. What do you say to identify yourself on the phone? You may say, speaking. How do you inquire if that's everything? Often after receiving a list or explanation. You may say, that's all? How do you ask someone to choose between going up or down, often in the context of an elevator or stairs? You may say, up or down.
What do you say to advise caution? You may say, stay out of trouble. How do you ask someone to stay longer? You may say, stick around. How do you encourage persistence? You may say, stick with it. What do you say to end someone's complaints? You may say, stop complaining. How do you say someone can choose for themselves? You may say suit yourself. How do you express approval of a job well done? You may say, excellent. What's a short word to say something is great? You may say, super. What's another way to say yes? Definitely. You may say, sure thing. How do you say you agree? You may say, sure. What do you say for a good night's sleep? You may say, sweet dreams.
How do you ask someone to make an educated guess? You may say, take a guess. Faye, can you guess? How do you ask for trust in what you're saying? You may say, take my word for it. What do you say to encourage someone not to rush? You may say, take your time. How do you ask someone to share more details? You may say, tell me about it. What do you say when relieved or grateful? You may say, thank God. How do you end a phone conversation politely? You may say, thanks for calling. What do you say to express general gratitude? You may say, thanks for everything. How do you accept a compliment graciously? You may say, thanks for the compliment. How do you show gratitude for a favor? You may say, thanks for the ride. How do you decline politely? You may say, thanks, but no thanks.
How do you say the answer varies? You may say, that depends. What do you say when something makes sense? You may say, that figures. How do you show understanding of a common situation? You may say, that happens. How do you say something will improve a situation? You may say, that should help. What do you say to agree with a suggestion? You may say, that sounds good. How do you express doubt about something happening? You may say, that will be the day. What do you say for a good deal? You may say, that's a steal. How do you express injustice? You may say, that's not fair, that's unfair. How do you say something is okay? You may say, that's all right. How do you say something is simple? You may say, that's all there is to it.